5 years ago, Lady Elara was the brightest jewel of the season. Now she stood in a muddy market street wearing a faded dress, holding her little son behind her, while 3 gentlemen laughed at her ruin. They had once bowed to her in ballrooms, now they called her shameful. They mocked her child, and Elara did not cry. She had learned after 5 years above a bakery, after cold water, hunger, whispers, and rejection, that some women survive by refusing to break where anyone can see. Then a black ducal carriage stopped in the street. The crowd fell silent. Duke Alaric Vane stepped down into the mud, tall, cold, feared, and powerful enough to ruin any man with a single word. He looked at the men tormenting her. He said one name, and suddenly the woman the world had forgotten became the woman no one dared insult again. Before we begin, welcome to Era 1800, where forgotten ladies, powerful dukes, hidden scandals, and impossible love stories come alive. If you enjoy emotional Regency romance, dramatic secrets, noble betrayals, and stories where love rises from ruin, make sure to subscribe to Era 1800 and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And as you listen, tell us in the comments, would you forgive the person who abandoned you when you needed them most? Now let us begin. There is a particular kind of strength that the world never thinks to celebrate, because it does not look like strength from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not carry a sword or ride into battle or stand at the front of a room commanding attention. It is the strength of a woman who wakes before the sun in a cold room above a bakery, who pulls on the same worn dress she wore the day before and the day before that, who looks at the small sleeping face of a child and decides, without drama and without an audience, that she will not break today, that she will not break tomorrow, that she will not break at all, no matter how many times the world applies itself to the task of breaking her. Lady Elara had been practicing this strength for 5 years. She had not always needed it. There had been a time not so long ago in the calendar of years, but so thoroughly separated from the present by the width of what had happened that it felt like a story about someone else, when strength of this kind had been entirely unnecessary, when she had been the sort of person for whom the world arranged itself, not through any particular effort on her part, but through the simple accident of birth and beauty and the social position that her family's name conferred on everyone who carried it. She had been called the diamond of the season in her 19th year, which was the kind of name that the Tun gave to young women, who possessed the particular combination of appearance and breeding and social ease that their world considered the highest possible achievement for a girl of good family. She had worn it lightly, as she wore most things. She was not a vain girl or a calculating one. She was simply a young woman who had grown up inside a certain kind of life and had assumed, as young people always assume about the lives they grow up inside, that the shape of it was permanent. She had been wrong about that, in the most complete way it was possible to be wrong. Her family had been landed gentry of the second rank, which meant that they possessed enough wealth and respectability to move in the first circles of the aristocracy while remaining perpetually aware of the distinction between themselves and those who occupied those circles by birthright, rather than by careful management of reputation and association. Her father had spent his entire adult life maintaining this position with the vigilance of a man who understands that the distance between his family's standing and a comfortable obscurity is not as large as he would prefer, and he had communicated this vigilance to his children in the way that parents communicate the things they are most afraid of, not through explicit instruction but through the quality of attention they brought to every social occasion, every public appearance, every interaction that might be observed and evaluated by the people whose good opinion was, in his calculation, the essential infrastructure of the family's existence. Elara had understood this. She had not resented it, exactly. She had simply lived inside it, as children live inside the architecture of their parents' anxieties, without examining it too closely. And then she had met Julian Ashworth. Lord Julian was the third son of a baronet, which placed him at approximately the same level of the social map as her own family, and he was handsome in the particular way of men who have understood very early that their appearance is an asset, and have organized their entire self-presentation around the deployment of that asset. He was charming in the way that people are charming when charm is primarily a tool rather than an expression of genuine warmth, which is to say that he was very charming indeed, because tools are most effective when their users have no ambivalence about using them. He had courted her with the focused attention of a man who had selected a target and applied himself to its acquisition, and she had received his attention with the pleasure of a young woman who does not yet have enough experience to distinguish between being loved and being wanted for reasons that have nothing to do with love. He was interesting, she had thought. He was confident. He knew things about the world beyond the narrow geography of the season's social rounds, or spoke as though he did, and she had found this refreshing in ways she did not fully understand until much later, when she understood them too well. The engagement had been announced in the spring of her 20th year, and her father had expressed satisfaction of the careful kind, the satisfaction of a man who has managed a social transaction adequately rather than brilliantly, and her mother had been pleased in the more immediate and less strategic way of a woman who was primarily concerned with her daughter's happiness and believed, because Elara seemed happy, that the happiness was well-founded. The summer that followed had been the last summer of the life she had grown up expecting to have. She remembered it afterward in the specific, painful detail with which we remember the last ordinary days before a catastrophe. The evenings in the garden, and the dinner parties, and the carriage rides, and the small social rituals that feel meaningless when they are happening, and become unbearably significant in memory. She had been happy. She had believed she was building something. In September, Julian vanished. Not in the dramatic fashion of a man who announces his departure or explains his absence. He simply was present one week and absent the next, and his absence produced, in the first days, the confused anxiety of a woman who does not yet know that what she is experiencing is the beginning of a catastrophe rather than some temporary disruption with a reasonable explanation. She sent notes that were not answered. She sent her maid to inquire at his townhouse and was told he was not in residence. She waited, which is what a woman of her position could do, because the alternatives available to her were so few and so compromised that waiting was the only option that did not make the situation worse. Situation became worse anyway. By October, the absence had become a story, and stories of this kind travel through the ton with a speed and a thoroughness that is directly proportional to the damage they carry. A young woman engaged to a man who had disappeared was a story. A young woman engaged to a man who had disappeared, and who was, by November, visibly with child, was a different kind of story entirely. The kind that the ton's particular machinery of judgment processes with the efficiency of a system that has been refined by generations of practice. Her father handled it with the speed that characterized everything he did when the family's position was under threat. He handled it before she had fully understood what was happening, before she had arrived at the place in her own reckoning where she could make any kind of argument for herself, because the argument he was making was not one he intended to have with her. It was an argument he was making to the world, and the argument was that the Elara who had made this particular error was no longer affiliated with the family that bore her name. He communicated this to the relevant people, and then he communicated it to her, and she sat in the study where she had grown up having the small important conversations of her childhood and listened to her father explain that the family had no choice, which was partly true and partly the way people describe choices they have already made. Her mother wept and said nothing that changed anything. She left with the clothes that were hers, and the small amount of money that her mother pressed into her hands in the corridor on the way out, pressed with the furtive urgency of someone performing an act of kindness that they are not permitted to perform openly, and she walked out of the house where she had lived for 20 years into the November cold. And she was entirely alone. Leo had been born the following February in a rented room that she had secured with the last of the money, and that was cold in the way that rented rooms near the bottom of the city's available accommodation are cold as a condition of the room rather than as a response to the season. He was born with the assistance of a midwife she had found, through the woman who ran the bakery below, a stout and practical woman who managed the birth with the efficient kindness of someone who has seen this particular situation before and has feelings about it that she keeps to herself because she has learned that feelings expressed to people in crisis rarely help the crisis. He was a remarkable child. She understood this immediately in the way of mothers who are not simply flattering themselves with the evidence of a particular quality of attention he brought to the world from the earliest age. He watched things. He asked questions that were more precisely formed than the questions of children his age had any reason to be. Questions that indicated he had been sitting with the observation for some time before giving it language. He had her grey eyes, and what she believed, in the privacy of her own heart, was the shape of her own face before it had been rearranged by 5 years of hard weather, and he had a seriousness in his expression that sat alongside his childhood brightness like a shadow alongside light. He had never had a father, which was the central fact of his small life, and the fact she could do the least about. He had her entirely and completely, and she had given him that with the ferocity of a woman for whom this child was not simply the thing she loved most, but the thing that had given the years of difficulty a structure and a purpose that they would otherwise have lacked. She worked constantly, and with the sustained physical effort of someone who does not have the option of stopping, taking in laundry for the households of the street and the streets adjacent, her hands in cold water for hours at a time, her back aching by the end of every day, her sleep reduced to the minimum that the human body requires to keep functioning. She kept the room warm when she could. She fed him before she fed herself. She taught him his letters with a book she had found discarded at a market stall, sitting with him in the evenings after the work was done, his head on her shoulder and her finger tracing the words, and the evenings were the best part of every day without exception. The shame was a separate thing, something she carried like a garment she could not remove, that the world pressed back onto her whenever she appeared in public. The women of her former circle, the ones who had attended the same teas and the same balls and had called themselves her friends, pulled their silk skirts away when she passed in the market with the specific gesture of women who wish to communicate contamination without being vulgar about it. Shopkeepers who had served her family for years found reasons to serve her slowly or not at all. Children in the street were pulled away by their mothers with whispered instructions not to look at the boy with the laundress. instructions that the children heard and internalized with the innocent efficiency of children processing the social architecture they are being built into, Leo noticed. She knew he noticed because he was Leo, and Leo noticed everything. He did not ask her directly about the pulling away or the whispered instructions because he was 5, and he did not yet have the language for the specific quality of social cruelty that was being directed at both of them. But she could see it in the way he pressed against her side in the market, the way he tracked certain faces with his serious eyes, and the way he sometimes asked her at night, in the quiet of the room above the bakery, why some people's faces looked like that. She told him that some people were afraid of things they did not understand, and that afraid people sometimes made poor choices about how to show it. He thought about this with the gravity he brought to everything she told him, and said that it seemed like it was their problem, and not their problem. At the same time, she held him and agreed that this was exactly right. Julian Ashworth returned to the city in the spring of Leo's 5th year. He had been gone for the entire duration of her disaster, which was not coincidence but strategy, the strategy of a man who had created a problem and then absented himself from it, with the self-preserving instinct of someone who understands that distance is the most effective form of deniability. He had returned, she learned through the market gossip that was her primary source of information about a social world she no longer officially occupied, because he was engaged to the daughter of an earl, a match of considerably greater financial and social significance than what Elara's family had ever been able to offer, and he had returned to conduct his courtship and his engagement announcement with the confident ease of a man who has performed his calculations and found them satisfactory. She should not have gone to him. She knew this. She knew it before she went, and she knew it more completely after. And the knowing did not prevent her from going, because she was not asking for herself. She was asking for Leo, for the question of the boy's schooling, which she could not afford, and which Julian could provide with a sum that would represent an inconsequential fraction of the fortune he was in the process of acquiring. She was not asking Julian to acknowledge Leo publicly. She was not asking him to provide anything beyond the minimal recognition that a man with his resources and his responsibility owed to a child he had fathered. She had written to him first. The letter was not returned, which meant it had been received, and no reply came, which meant it had been read and dismissed. She had written again. The same silence. She had then done the thing she had been trying not to do, which was to present herself at the garden party hosted by the family of his new fiancé, a party she had no legitimate grounds for attending, at which she was visible and unmistakable and entirely out of place. Julian had looked at her across the garden with the expression of a man confronted with an inconvenience he had already decided he was not going to accommodate, and then he had said the things he said with the full awareness of the audience he had constructed around himself, loudly enough to ensure he was heard by the people who would carry what he said to the people who would make good use of it. He called her a gutter maid. He said he did not know who she was. He said these things in the voice of a man who has spent enough time around power to have learned how to use cruelty as a social performance, demonstrating to his new circles that he has entirely severed himself from the embarrassments of his past, that the past is not real to him, that the woman standing in front of him does not register as a human being in any category that requires consideration. She stood in the garden, and she did not cry. This was the thing she had trained herself to across 5 years, because she had understood early that crying in public would be taken as confirmation of weakness rather than as evidence of the reasonable human response to unreasonable treatment. and she had decided she would not give the people who watched her suffer the satisfaction of watching her break. She stood with Leo's hand in hers, and she looked at Julian Ashworth across the party grass, and she thought, with the clarity that comes from standing at the absolute bottom of a fall and looking up at where you started, that she had been wrong about many things in her life, but she had never been wrong about herself. And that was the thing they could not take from her. She took Leo home. Duke Alaric Vane had not intended to be in the market district on a Tuesday morning in late April. He had intended to travel north from his estate to his London townhouse by the direct route which did not pass through the market. But his driver had been navigating a road congestion near the parliamentary buildings and had taken an alternative way through the older part of the city, and Alaric had been reading papers in the carriage and had not paid attention to the route until the carriage slowed and then stopped, and he looked up to identify the cause of the delay. He was a man who had been described by almost everyone who knew him through the lens of his title and its reputation, which preceded him everywhere he went like a formal announcement of terms. The Iron Duke, some called him, though Alaric found the epithet tedious. The Merciless, others said, which was an exaggeration based on a handful of legal judgments he had made in his capacity as magistrate, judgments that were merciless only in the sense of being accurate, of refusing to accommodate the comfortable fictions that the ton preferred to maintain about the relationship between social standing and actual conduct. He had made enemies through this accuracy. He had found this an acceptable cost. He was 32 years old, and had held the dukedom since his father's death 8 years prior, and those 8 years had produced in him the kind of man that early responsibility in a cold environment produces, someone who has been tested thoroughly and found adequate to the tests, and who has organized himself around adequacy with the no-nonsense efficiency of a person who has no patience for performance. He was tall and dark-haired and had the kind of face that fell naturally into severity, the kind that required deliberate effort to soften, and that he rarely made that effort, because softening for the benefit of people who had not earned it struck him as a waste of energy that could be better applied elsewhere. He was also, though very few people were in a position to observe this because very few people were permitted into the spaces where it was visible, a man of considerable interior warmth, the warmth of someone who has spent enough time around the varieties of human suffering to have developed genuine compassion for it, who keeps that compassion largely private because the social world he moves in has a consistent history of treating visible emotion as a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a quality to be respected. He saw her from the carriage window before he fully understood what he was seeing. A group of 3 men, young and well-dressed, with the specific carelessness of people who have never been required to care about the impression they make on anyone below. Their station had arranged themselves around a woman and a child in a way that was not accidental. They were not threatening violence, which would have been a different kind of visible problem. They were doing something that required no physical contact and left no marks, the thing that people of their class had always done to people in their power, which was to occupy the social space around them in a way that communicated their contempt with the full force of their position, loudly enough for the market around them to hear. They were making her the object of a public entertainment. They were performing their disdain for the benefit of the audience that the market provided, and the audience was providing the response that such performances always extract from people who are not the ones in the stocks, which was the uneasy combination of relief and complicity that comes from being on the permitted side of a public humiliation. He saw the woman. She was standing with her back not quite against the wall of the market stall, in the posture of someone who has placed herself to ensure that the child behind her is shielded on at least one side. She was not attempting to appease the men. She was not attempting to argue with them or engage with their performance in any way that would feed it. She was standing with the specific stillness of a woman who has decided to outlast what is happening rather than resist it directly. Her face composed in the expression of someone who is feeling a great deal and is displaying none of it, because displaying it would cost her something she cannot afford to lose. The child behind her was looking at the men with the serious, direct attention of a small person cataloging information about a threat, not with fear in the immediate, reactive sense, but with the focused watchfulness of someone who is old enough to understand that what is happening is not right, and young enough to not yet know what to do with that understanding. Alaric was out of the carriage before his footman had completed the step. He crossed the market ground to where the group was arranged with the pace of a man moving towards something he has already decided to address, which is a different pace from any other, and the people in the market recognized it. The men themselves registered his approach at different moments, the first at the point where the crowd's attention shifted, the second when he was close enough that his height and the quality of his presence became unmistakable, and the third and most oblivious of them when Alaric was 3 feet away and said his name. He said the name in the tone of a man who uses very few words, because each word is doing a considerable amount of work, and the work that name was doing in that tone, in that specific combination of social authority and personal menace, was the work of a full sentence that communicated the end of the entertainment, and the beginning of something whose costs the men were not prepared to pay. They left, not gracefully, not without the mutterings of men who are accustomed to having the last word and are finding it unavailable, but they left, and the market resumed its noise around the space they vacated. He looked at the woman. She was looking at him with the same composed directness she had maintained throughout the preceding exchange, and there was in her expression the clear acknowledgement that she understood what he had done, and the equally clear refusal to perform gratitude in the way that the social situation might seem to require. She was not going to be theatrical about having been rescued. She was going to receive what had happened with the same steady self-possession she had applied to the difficulty that preceded it, which was the self-possession of a woman who has learned that the maintenance of herself is the only thing fully within her control, and who has decided to maintain it absolutely. He observed this with interest. He asked without preamble if she and the boy were all right. She said they were. He asked if this type of thing was a regular occurrence. She said that regular was perhaps the honest word for it. He looked at the boy, who was looking at him with the focused, assessing attention of a small person who has learned not to trust quickly, but who is doing the calculation, honestly, and he said to the boy that he had conducted himself well. The boy looked at him for a moment and then said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect, that he had not done anything. Alaric said that standing steady when people want to see you fall is doing something considerable, and the boy absorbed this with the gravity of someone filing it for future examination. He went back to his carriage and to his papers and continued north to London, and the image of the woman in the market stayed with him with the particular persistence of things that have engaged some part of your attention that you did not know was waiting to be engaged. He investigated. This was not unusual behavior for him. He was a man who gathered information before drawing conclusions, who applied the same methodical attention to questions of human conduct that he applied to questions of law and estate management, and the question of a woman of obvious refinement living in reduced circumstances in a market district was a question that had answers if you knew where to look and had the resources to look there. What he found was a story that was, in its particulars, entirely ordinary by the standards of the world that had produced it, and in its particulars also entirely damning of that world. A broken engagement, a disappearance, a pregnancy, the specific machinery of social ruin grinding itself against a woman who had committed no wrong, beyond trusting a man who had not been worthy of trust, a machinery that had been running for 5 years with the institutional efficiency of a system that does not need to think about what it is doing, because it has been doing it for so long that it has become simply what happens. He found the original marriage contract, which had been drawn up before Julian's disappearance, and which was, under the relevant law, as binding as a signed and witnessed document of that nature is required to be. He found the record of Julian's return and his new engagement. He found the record of Elara's petition at the garden party, and what Julian had said there, which had been reported with the gleeful specificity of society gossip by people who had found the spectacle entertaining. He found, in a detail that he considered with a quality of cold attention that was, for him, the precursor to decisive action, the instruction that had been delivered to the landlord of the building where Elara and her son lived. The instruction had come through an intermediary, as these things always do, but intermediaries leave trails if you know where to look, and the trail led to Julian Ashworth's household accounts with the directness of a line drawn by someone who had not been careful enough because he had not imagined that anyone would bother to look. Alaric read the eviction notice that had been served that week and made several decisions. He arrived at the street above the bakery on a Thursday morning in his carriage, which was a large and distinctive vehicle of the kind that communicated its owner's status to everyone in a position to observe it, and which on a street of this type was as conspicuous as a foreign object dropped from a great height. The neighborhood noticed, the bakery owner noticed. The landlord, who was in the process of conducting the eviction, with the defensive brusqueness of a man doing something he knows is unpleasant but has been compensated to consider necessary, noticed most prominently. Elara was on the street with Leo and a bundle of their belongings, in the specific posture of a woman who has been through enough that the addition of another catastrophe does not break her, because she has already reorganized herself around the understanding that breaking is not available. She was maintaining the same composure she maintained everywhere. The composure that was not remoteness or indifference, but was something harder and more earned, the composure of a woman who has paid full price for the ability to stand in a difficult moment without collapsing. The carriage stopped. The door opened. A man stepped down onto the street, into the mud of an unpaved road, in a part of the city that was not accustomed to carriages of this description or men of this bearing, and the street reorganized its attention around him with the immediacy of people who recognize authority in its most concentrated form. He walked to where Elara was standing. He looked at the landlord with the brief, precise expression of a man communicating a conclusion rather than opening a negotiation, and the landlord found, under that expression, a sudden willingness to reconsider the timeline of the proceedings. He looked at Elara, who was looking at him with the expression she had worn in the market, the composed, direct, assessing expression of a woman who does not know what to make of what is happening, and is not going to pretend that she does. He extended his hand. It was the specific gesture of a man offering assistance in the formal way, the way that offered her a choice rather than simply acting on her behalf. And she understood that it was this, understood that it was not charity in the way that charity humiliates, but something being presented to her as a person capable of deciding. And she stood with Leo against her side and looked at the extended hand for a moment that contained the entire weight of the past 5 years. She took it. Leo looked up at the tall man who had appeared in their street, and then up at his mother, and then back at the man, and said, with the clarity of a child who states what he observes without editorial, that the carriage was very large. Alaric looked down at him and said that it was, and asked if he had any objections to riding in it. Leo considered this with the gravity he brought to every question, put to him directly, and said that he supposed he did not, said that he was glad to hear it. The estate that they arrived at 3 hours later was everything that the word ducal was meant to convey, which is to say that it was very large and very old and very thoroughly built in the way of houses that have been maintained by families who understand that the house is also a statement, and the statement is about permanence. Elara sat in the carriage as it passed through the gates and along the avenue of old trees that led to the main entrance, and felt something she had not felt in 5 years, which was the sensation of a space that had been constructed for comfort rather than for bare necessity, and the sensation was complicated by the awareness that she did not know what it meant that she was here. Alaric had told her, in the carriage, with the direct economy of a man who says the relevant things and leaves the rest to be established by events, that he was offering rooms for her and for Leo, not as servants and not as charity cases, but as guests for whom the house had space and whose presence in it was his decision to extend. He said this as a statement of terms rather than as an explanation requiring her agreement, and then he had gone back to his papers, which she found in the context of what had just happened. The most unexpectedly reassuring thing he could have done, because it communicated that he was not performing a rescue and did not require her to perform gratitude for it, that this was simply a decision he had made in the normal course of his business. The housekeeper, a woman of middle age with the organized competence of someone who has managed a large household for a long time and has long since ceased to be surprised by the things her employer does, showed them to rooms on the upper corridor that were warm and clean and contained, among other things, a bed large enough for Leo to be in it without being in immediate danger of rolling out, which was a quality that distinguished it from every place they had slept for 5 years. Leo stood in the room and turned around slowly, examining it with his cataloguing attention, and then he looked at his mother and said that it was quite a lot of room. She said that it was. He said that it was probably enough room for all of his things, and she said that she thought it was, and he nodded with the satisfied practicality of a small person who has assessed a situation and found it adequate to his requirements. She sat on the edge of the large bed after he was asleep that night, and looked at the ceiling of a room that was warmer than any room she had occupied in 5 years, and felt the complicated thing that people feel when the persistent worst of their lives shifts unexpectedly into something else, which is not simply relief but is relief and fear, and the specific uncertainty of someone who does not yet know how to inhabit good fortune, without waiting for it to be taken back. She did not cry. She had not cried in public in 5 years, and she was not going to begin in a room that belonged to someone else. But she sat for a long time in the quiet warmth and breathed it in, and it was something. Alaric had been prepared to dislike the child. This was not a position he had arrived at through any particular hostility toward children as a category. It was the practical preparation of a man who has introduced an unknown variable into his household, and who does not want to develop an attachment to that variable before he has established its qualities. He had been prepared to find Leo difficult, or cowed, or the kind of unnaturally quiet that children who have been through difficult circumstances sometimes become. He found, instead, a boy who asked him, on the second morning, whether the painting in the library of a man on a horse was meant to be a good painting, or whether it was there because the man in it had been important. Alaric looked at the painting, which had been hanging in the library since before his father's time, and which he had looked at his entire life without ever having found occasion to form an opinion about its artistic merit, because no one had ever asked him question in precisely those terms, and he said that he had honestly never thought about it. Leo said that the horses were wrong. Alaric looked at the horse's legs. He said that he thought the boy was correct. Leo looked satisfied. He said that it was probably there because the man had been important. Alaric said that was his assessment also. Leo then asked, with the transition that children make between topics with a speed that takes adults by surprise if they are not paying attention, whether there were books in the library that were about how things worked, specifically how bridges worked, because he had been thinking about bridges since crossing one the previous day, and he wanted to understand the structure. Alaric showed him the engineering section. He spent an hour that afternoon in the library with the boy, which had not been his intention, watching Leo move through the texts with the focused, slightly frowning attention of someone engaging with material that is above his reading level, but below his comprehension level, which was a combination that Alaric found remarkable in a child of 5. He answered questions when asked and asked his own questions when the opportunity presented itself, and by the end of the hour he had formed the opinion, clearly and without sentimentality, that this was an unusual child, and that the particular quality of his intelligence was one that deserved access to everything that a proper education could provide. He said nothing to Elara about this that evening. He watched her instead across several days, with the same quality of observational patience he brought to every assessment he made of something that mattered. She was careful. She was careful in the way of someone who does not trust the stability of good fortune, who moves through comfortable spaces with the faint uncertainty of a person waiting for the ground to shift. She maintained the composure he had observed in the market, which he understood more fully now as something she had built deliberately over years, rather than something she possessed naturally, the way a callus is built over a wound. She was intelligent in ways that the domestic tasks she applied herself to without being asked did not fully reveal, but that emerged in the occasional evenings when they found themselves in the library together, and conversation developed in the direction of the substantive rather than the social, she read. This was not remarkable by itself, but the way she read was remarkable, with the complete absorption of someone for whom a book is not a social performance or a leisure activity, but a genuine engagement with ideas that she finds worth engaging with. He had come to the library late on 3 separate evenings to find her in the chair nearest the lamp with a text that was not a novel and not a decorative volume, but something dense and considered that she was working through with the attentive discipline of a student who has no teacher to set the pace and is therefore setting it herself. He began to understand, across those early weeks, that what he was looking at was the education of a woman who had been formed by a system designed to prevent her from being formed by any system, except the one that would make her useful to the social architecture that required women of her class to be decorative rather than capable, and that she had, in the 5 years of her exclusion from that system, proceeded to form herself anyway, with whatever materials she could find, out of the specific stubbornness of a person who refuses to accept that the life they were born into is the ceiling of what they can become. He had never in his life met anyone exactly like her. He kept this assessment private, which was the only kind of assessment he trusted, because the social world he moved in was a world in which private feelings expressed publicly had a consistent history of being used against the people who expressed them. The rumors reached him before they reached her. They had been building since her arrival at the estate, because the arrival of a woman with an illegitimate child at the household of the most eligible and most determinedly unattached duke in the kingdom was the kind of event that the Tun's rumor machinery processed with the same efficiency it brought to every scandal, which was the efficiency of people who have made other people's business their primary occupation. The range of interpretation being applied to the situation was, he was told by his secretary, who maintained a diplomatic awareness of these things, wide and mostly unflattering to everyone involved. There was the faction that assumed he had taken in a mistress, which they considered predictable. There was the faction that assumed he would tire of the novelty quickly, and she would be removed, which they considered certain. There was the smaller faction, the most uncomfortable one, which had begun to do the arithmetic of the situation and had arrived at a calculation that they found deeply interesting and entirely threatening to the social order as they understood it. He let the rumors run. He did not address them because addressing them would have been to engage with the premise that other people's interpretation of his decisions required his response, and he had never once accepted that premise. He had a decision to make, and he was making it with the same methodical deliberation he brought to every important decision, which meant gathering all the relevant information, and then sitting with the conclusions it produced until he was certain. He called Julian Ashworth to a private meeting. This was not communicated as a request. Julian arrived at the townhouse Alaric, maintained in London with the expression of a man who has been asked to account for himself by someone whose authority he cannot dismiss, and who is attempting to manage his nerves with the overlay of the social confidence he normally deployed effortlessly. He looked, in the absence of an audience whose approval he was performing for, substantially less formidable than his garden party appearance had suggested. Alaric received him in his study with no particular social warmth and set out, on the desk between them, the documents he had assembled over the preceding weeks, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who does not make accusations he cannot support. The marriage contract which was binding, the record of the pregnancy, the record of Julian's disappearance and his subsequent return, the instruction regarding the eviction, with the trail that led back to Julian's household, the account of the garden party in written form, with several witnesses named. He spoke for approximately 10 minutes, and said everything that needed to be said, and nothing that did not, and Julian sat across the desk in the expression of a man watching the distance between himself and a comfortable outcome growing rapidly in the wrong direction. The ball was announced 3 weeks later. Alaric issued the invitations through his secretary, with the specificity of a man who has decided exactly who is required to be present and exactly what the occasion is going to accomplish. The invitations reached the relevant houses with the authority that an invitation from his household carried, which was the authority of something that was not quite optional. The Tun received them with the combination of avidity and unease that always accompanies an event organized by someone they know to be unpredictable. Elara was told about the ball on the morning of the week prior. He told her himself in the library, with the directness that was his consistent mode. He said that there were things that had been held over her for 5 years that were going to be addressed publicly, and that he wanted her present and standing when they were addressed, and that the address was going to require a specific setting and a specific audience. He said that she was not required to do anything except be present and be herself, which was, he said, in his considered opinion, more than sufficient. She looked at him across the library with the expression she wore when she was working through something of significance, the slightly inward expression of a woman engaging seriously with the implications of what she has just been told, and then she asked him what his intentions were. He told her. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. She said that she understood that he was doing this because he believed it was just, and that she appreciated that the motivation was justice rather than charity, and then she said that she wanted to know whether the man who was proposing to restructure the entire public narrative of her life had any feelings toward her that were not purely directed by justice, because she had spent 5 years having other people make decisions that affected her life without her input, and she was not going to proceed through another one without asking the relevant question. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been asked a direct question by someone he respects and who owes them a direct answer. He said that his feelings toward her were not purely directed by justice. She said that she needed him to be specific. He said that he had found her, over the preceding weeks, to be the most interesting person he had met in a considerable number of years, that the quality of her mind, and the quality of her character, and quality of the particular kind of strength she had constructed from the materials her difficulty had provided, were things that he had come to regard with an admiration that had become, somewhere in the ordinary days of the library and the evenings and the conversations about things that mattered, something that he would not describe with that word if that word were adequate to it. She looked at him for a long moment. She said that she had a son. He said that he was aware of Leo's existence. She said that Leo was not negotiable. He said that Leo was not something he was proposing to negotiate. He said that Leo was 7 years old, which was incorrect because Leo was 5, and Leo, who was sitting behind one of the larger bookshelves, and had been conducting a private investigation of the lower shelves for the past 20 minutes, said from behind the shelf that he was 5. There was a pause. Alaric said that he stood corrected, and Elara said that Leo was not supposed to be in the library at this hour, and Leo emerged from behind the shelf with a book about structural engineering and an expression of engaged innocence. Alaric looked at the book and then at Leo and then at Elara, and said that he thought they had perhaps arrived at a natural conclusion to the more formal portion of the conversation. She was dressed for the ball in sapphire and silver, which was a combination she had not worn in 5 years, and had not expected to wear again, and which was, she understood when she saw herself in the glass, the combination that had always suited her best, that the Ton had always seen her in. That was itself a kind of statement about continuity, about the fact that the woman who had stood in the season's ballrooms was the same woman as the one who had stood in the market street, that neither one was more or less herself than the other. She did not feel like the diamond of the season, which was a title that belonged to someone younger and less complicated. She felt like what she was, which was a woman of 25 who had been through a great deal and had arrived intact, carrying everything she had carried and everything she had become, and who was about to walk into a room full of people who had watched her fall and had for the most part found the falling entertaining. Leo had been left with the housekeeper, which he had accepted with the negotiated dignity of a child who has been permitted to choose the book he would read during the absence and has decided to make the best of the arrangement. She took his hand before she fell asleep that night, in the way she always did. She told him it was one evening and that she would be back before he was awake in the morning. He said that he knew. He said that the housekeeper had promised him the kitchen would have biscuits. She said that the housekeeper was a woman of her word. He said that was good to know. He closed his eyes with the easy confidence of a child who has been loved absolutely, and who therefore carries that love with him into every space, and the sight of it, the absolute ordinary completeness of it, steadied her in the way that only Leo could steady her. The ballroom went silent in the specific way that large social gatherings go silent when something sufficiently remarkable enters them, the conversation and the music both ceasing by degrees, as the awareness traveled through the room of what had arrived in the doorway. She walked in. She walked in the way she had always walked into rooms, which was not with performance or calculation, but with the simple quality of a woman who has always known how to occupy the space she is in. She was on Alaric's arm, and he was beside her with the same composed authority that characterized him in every public space, the authority of a man who has decided what this evening is and is not particularly interested in alternative interpretations. The room found its voice again gradually, in the way that shocked rooms always do, beginning at the margins and working inward, the whispers first and then the full conversational tide, but with a quality it had not had before her entrance, the quality of a room that has understood that the evening is not going to be what it expected. Julian Ashworth was present. He had been required to be present, which was not precisely the wording in the invitation, but was the effective meaning of an invitation from this host for a man whose current social standing depended on the goodwill of exactly the people who would be in attendance, and he was standing near the far wall with the expression of a man who had arrived, knowing that the evening would be difficult and was in the process of discovering that difficult was an underestimate. He attempted it once toward the early part of the evening, leaning toward the small group nearest him and saying something low and directing that something at Elara, the word she'd been hearing applied to Leo for 5 years, by people who used it as a weapon, without considering that weapons cut the people who wield them as well as their targets. The word traveled the distance from Julian's mouth to Alaric's awareness through the mechanism of the crowd, which has never been efficient at containing information of this kind. And Alaric's response was to move toward the center of the room with a quality of purpose that the assembled guests, who were experienced in reading the social weather of powerful men, processed immediately. He did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches, and the occasion did not require one. What it required, and what he provided, was the thing he had prepared over the preceding weeks, with the methodical attention he brought to everything important, which was evidence, presented in the clear, formal register of a man who practices law as well as social authority, that the story that Tunn had been telling about Lady Elara Whitmore for 5 years was not the story that the documents supported. He produced the marriage contract. He named its date and its witnesses and its legal validity, and he named the man who had signed it and subsequently abandoned it and subsequently denied its existence, and he named what that denial constituted under the law. He produced the record of Julian's instruction to the landlord, which he read aloud with the same tone in which he would have read any other piece of evidence in any formal proceeding, and the room received it with the silence of people confronted with information that requires them to revise a comfortable narrative they have been maintaining for 5 years, he announced his intention to marry Lady Elara Whitmore, and his intention to legally recognize her son as his own and as his heir. And he said these things in the same measured, declarative tone in which he had said everything else, as statements of fact about what was going to happen, rather than as positions to be argued or proposals subject to social negotiation. Julian Ashworth left the ball that evening and did not attend another social function in the city for a very long time, because the standing he had built on the rubble of Elara's reputation had been removed from beneath him with a thoroughness that left nothing to rebuild on, and because the specific quality of public accounting that had been directed at him in that room was the kind from which men of his type do not recover. The people who had pulled their silk skirts away from Elara in the market, the women who had instructed their children not to look at Leo, the former friends who had found it so much easier to be kind when kindness was socially cost-free and so much easier to be cruel when cruelty was, turned their faces toward her now with expressions that she recognized for what they were, which was the expressions of people recalibrating the calculation and finding that the calculation had changed. She did not receive these recalibrations with warmth. She was polite because she was always polite, and she was composed because she was always composed, and she said the socially appropriate things in the socially appropriate register, and she felt, underneath all of it, the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned, across 5 years of having the social currency stripped away, exactly what social currency was worth and exactly what it was not worth. What it was not worth was any revision of what she knew to be true about the people who were now bowing to her. What it was worth was exactly this, the formal restoration of the space in the world that had been taken from her and from Leo, the space that a child has a right to inhabit without being called by words designed to mark him as less than, the space that she had always had a right to, and had been denied not because she had done anything to forfeit it, but because the people who controlled the allocation of such spaces had found it convenient to deny it. She stood in the ballroom in the sapphire and silver, and she thought about Leo asleep in the room with the biscuit promised by the housekeeper, and the structural engineering book on the table beside the bed. And she felt, rising through the composure she had always maintained as an act of will, something that did not need to be maintained because it was simply there, which was the specific, quiet joy of a woman who has survived everything the world applied to the project of her destruction, and finds herself on the other side of it, entirely intact. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. Nothing about a life is uncomplicated, and a life built from the materials that theirs had been built from carried the marks of its construction in ways that did not simply dissolve, because the circumstances had changed. She carried the knowledge of the market street and the cold room and the worn dress and the hands in the cold water, carried it not as a wound but as a kind of compass, the way people carry the hardest things they have survived as evidence of what they are, capable of surviving, as information about themselves that more comfortable lives do not provide. Alaric carried his own version of this, the marks of a life organized entirely around the management of other people's expectations and his own duty, the marks of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the coldest, most reliable instrument in any room, and who was in the process, carefully and without any particular social grace, because social grace was not his natural mode, of learning to be something warmer. Leo grew. He grew in the way that children who have been formed by difficulty and then given space and resources grow, which is with a specific combination of rootedness and reach. the rootedness of someone who has always known the value of the solid ground beneath them, and the reach of someone who has been told that the solid ground is what makes the reach possible. He was a remarkable boy who became a remarkable young man, who carried the estate's accounting ledgers at 14 with the same focused attention he had brought to the structural engineering texts at 5, who spoke in the council chamber at 16 with the clear, grounded authority of someone who has been mentored by people who take ideas seriously. He had Elara's grey eyes. He had, as he grew, something of Alaric's quality of stillness, the stillness of someone who has learned, in the presence of a person who modeled it, that the deliberate use of attention is the most powerful instrument available to anyone, that the world reveals itself fully only to people willing to be patient with it. He asked her once, when he was perhaps 9 or 10, about the early years. He asked in the way he always asked difficult things, directly and without the social hedging, that children learn to apply to questions they sense might be uncomfortable, because she had always answered his direct questions directly, and he had learned from this that direct questions were worth asking. She told him. She told him about the room above the bakery, and the laundry, and the cold water, and the market, and the people who had pulled their skirts away. She told him about the garden party. She told him about the eviction. She told it plainly without protecting him from the weight of it, because she had decided early that the things that had shaped her life were not things she was going to make mysterious to the person whose life had been most shaped by them. He listened with the attention he always gave to things that mattered, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked what she had thought about on the hardest days when things were at their worst. She said that she had thought about him, mostly. She said that there had been mornings when the hardest thing was getting up, and the thing that made getting up possible was his face, which was the most honest and the most important thing she could tell him about those years, and she was not going to dress it up into something more impressive. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said that he thought that was impressive enough. She kept the laundry rags. They were folded in a small box in the wardrobe of the room that was now entirely hers, a room larger and warmer than any room she had occupied in the years of her difficulty, and she did not display them, and she did not speak about them often, but she knew they were there, and the knowing was important to her. They were not a record of shame. She had decided this deliberately and with the full weight of someone who understands the difference between what a symbol is and what a symbol is permitted to mean, that the meaning of a symbol is in the interpretation brought to it rather than in the object itself, and she had brought to those rags the interpretation she chose. They were the evidence of what she had been capable of. The portrait that hung in the long gallery of the estate was painted in the 4th year of the marriage by a portraitist of considerable skill, who had been commissioned to produce a family portrait in the traditional style of the ducal household. He had done his work well. The painting showed a man of dark, composed bearing, and a woman in sapphire and silver, and a boy of 9 who looked out of the canvas with his serious grey eyes and the expression of someone who is aware that the moment is being recorded and finds this interesting rather than ceremonial. It hung in the gallery between portraits of Alaric's father and grandfather in the sequence of the family's history, and the visitors who walked the gallery and looked at the faces in the frames walked past Leo's face as they walked past every other face in the sequence, with the acknowledgement that the sequence accorded to people who belonged to it. The boy who had been called by words designed to mark him as less than looked out of the canvas with his mother's eyes and his own expression, and the solid, unremarkable confidence of someone who knows exactly where he stands, which is the confidence that only a fully established and deeply secured sense of home can produce. She stood before the portrait sometimes, on quiet mornings before the house was fully awake, and looked at the three of them in the painting with the specific combination of emotions that only the completed chapters of our lives produce, the gratitude that is almost too large to hold, the grief that does not go away but changes its shape, the pride that is not about what was accomplished, but about who survived the accomplishing. She thought about the woman who had walked out of her family's house in November with nothing but her clothes and her mother's furtive money and the child she did not yet know she was strong enough to raise. And she thought about what that woman would have made of the painting on the wall, and she thought that the most honest answer was that the woman would not have been able to imagine it, because you cannot imagine what you become in the process of surviving something until you have survived it and become it, and by then the imagining has been replaced by the thing itself. Alaric came to stand beside her on a morning in the spring, in the way he had acquired over the years of their life together, the habit of finding her in whatever space she occupied, and simply being in it with her, which was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced, and the thing she thought, if she had to choose a single thing, that she would least be willing to lose. He stood beside her and looked at the painting with the expression he wore when he was thinking about something he was not going to say unless she asked him. And she looked at the painting and then at him and said that she knew he had a thought. He said that the painter had gotten the horse in the old painting wrong. She looked at him. He said that Leo had pointed this out when the painter was visiting to do the preliminary studies, that the boy had spent 20 minutes providing the painter with a technical analysis of equine anatomy derived from a book on veterinary science that he had found in the upper library, and that the painter had been simultaneously annoyed and enlightened. She laughed. The laugh was unreserved, the full laugh of a woman in a space where nothing is required of her and everything is permitted, and it moved through the quiet gallery with the sound of something that had never been possible in a cold room above a bakery, and that was entirely possible here. Alaric watched her laugh, and his expression moved into something she had come to know as his equivalent of the same laugh, the reserved but genuine shift of a man whose warmth was real and whose expression of it had its own language, and they stood together in the gallery, with the portraits of the family around them, and the spring light coming through the high windows, and the estate beginning its days outside in the sounds of horses and groundskeepers, and the ordinary productive noise of a house fully alive. She reached back and took his hand, not looking at him, still looking at the painting, and he closed his hand around hers with the steadiness that was his fundamental quality, the steadiness she had first recognized in the market street, and had come to understand as the truest and most permanent thing about him. Leo was in the courtyard below the window. They could hear the sound of the practice, the measured rhythm of a young person working at something he is serious about, working at it with the focus of someone who has been taught that the most important things are worth the sustained and patient effort they require. She stood in the gallery with Alaric's hand in hers and listened to her son practice, and looked at his face in the painting on the wall, the face of a child who had been called by every name designed to diminish him, and who had been raised by a woman who refused to let those names be the last word, who had been given by circumstance and stubbornness and one cold man's decision to step into the mud of a market street, the foundation on which everything else had been built. She looked at the laundry rags folded in the box upstairs, and the painting on the wall, and the hand in hers, and the sound from the courtyard. And she understood, with the complete, unhurried certainty of a woman who has earned the right to her understanding, that none of this had been given to her. Not by luck, not by rescue, not by the intervention of a powerful man at the right moment. All of that had been the occasion. The thing itself, the life in the portrait, the child in the courtyard, the man beside her, had been built from something that the occasion alone could never have produced. It had been built from the bread of sorrows, from the cold water and the worn dress, and the morning after morning of refusing to break, from the 5 years of standing steady in market streets and garden parties, and the flat judgment of a world that had decided she was not worth the consideration it had briefly extended her. It had been built from the strength that does not look like strength from the outside, that has no audience and no ceremony, that announces itself to no one because it is too busy being exercised to stop for recognition. She had known, somewhere in those years, that she was building something. She had not known what it was. She looked at what it was. She kept looking at it for a long time, with the full and unhurried attention of a woman who has earned the right to this morning and this painting, and this hand in hers and this sound from the courtyard, who intends to spend every remaining moment of her life in the full possession of what she has built, and who would not trade a single morning of the cold room for the life she stands in now, because the cold room was the forge, and the forge was the truth, and the truth was that she had always been exactly strong enough. She had simply needed the time to find out.